For the past 18 years, the term neo-vintage has been discussed by the community. It's short-lived, but every few months it comes back, and every time it does, nobody agrees on what it actually means. Within enthusiast circles, neo-vintage is commonly used when talking about a specific era, watches roughly from the late 1970s through the early 2000s that occupy a transitional place between true vintage and contemporary pieces. These watches share certain generational characteristics: early sapphire crystals, the shift from tritium to luminova lume, slimmer cases compared to later oversized trends, and transitional sport watch designs, from bands big and small. Collectors began using the term for watches that are not old enough to be classified strictly as vintage, but still carry some of the aesthetic and cultural cues of the past, while maintaining modern reliability and practicality. A neo-vintage Rolex from the 1990s with a tritium patina and sapphire crystal feels different from a 2020s model. It's physically more modern than a classic vintage Rolex from the 1950s, yet stylistically closer to a past era, down to ultra-contemporary references. That in-between quality is what neo-vintage originally described. However, as the term entered general usage, it began to be applied in ways that confuse many people. Modern brands now use neo-vintage to describe new watches inspired by 1970s or 1980s design. Watches that never existed in those decades, but intentionally evoke their look. That's where the disconnect starts. The word is used both for old watches and new watches that look old. Some collectors push back on neo-vintage when applied to quartz-era watches from the 70s and 80s. Their argument? Those watches don't qualify as vintage, the way pre-1970 pieces do, because they were mass-produced in a survival era for the industry, and often lack the finishing, patina, and artisanal narrative we associate with classic mechanical watches. For them, quartz-era design vocabulary doesn't evoke vintage so much as retro, and now they prefer the term neo-retro when talking about purely stylistic inspiration in modern pieces. Neo-vintage, in the traditional sense, was about that era's watches themselves. Watches you can still wear daily, with sapphire crystals and modern water resistance, yet with design cues that feel rooted in the past. Today, the term gets stretched to include retro-inspired new watches, and that's where confusion breeds debate. The key takeaway isn't which label is correct, but that the term's evolution mirrors how the market and language around watches evolve as well. So, if neo-vintage is more than just a label, what's fueling interest in it? One answer is fatigue with decades of maximalism. For years, the watch world chased bigger, louder, more hyped-out designs, oversized cases, integrated bracelet hype, spec-sheet wars, maximalist flex culture. That era had its moment, but trends don't move in straight lines. They oscillate. And right now, there's a shift toward restraint and refinement. We're seeing renewed appreciation for features and aesthetics that once defined classic watchmaking. Jump hours, where the hour jumps in a window instead of moving via a hand. Sector dials, with distinct geometric layouts. Smaller dress watches, often under 38mm. Thin cases and pared back proportions. Manual wind movements, calling attention to simplicity and engagement. This is not about nostalgia alone, but about crafts and design maturity. Modern movements and materials make watches reliable and robust, while design choices inspired by earlier eras connect emotionally with wearers. Emerging designs that echo vintage cues, rotated fonts, lacquered dials, refined hands, evoke craftsmanship without sacrificing performance. These modern complications and finishes represent a point where art and engineering intersect in ways that feel intentional, rather than nostalgic alone. Let's clear up the terminology, because watch jargon can be messy. Vintage generally means old enough that it reflects its original cultural and design era. Experts say that anything between the ages of 20 to 99 makes a piece vintage, or anything between the years 1900s to the end of the 1960s. Pre-owned simply means used, regardless of age. A 3-year-old watch sold secondhand is pre-owned, not necessarily vintage. Retro means a modern watch, designed with stylistic influence from older watches, without being old itself. Neo-vintage is most tightly applied to transitional watches, often from the late 1980s through the early 2000s, that have characteristics reminiscing of vintage pieces, but include modern technical improvements. This distinction matters because it helps separate emotional value from chronological age. A vintage watch carries decades of context and patina. A retro watch channels design language from the past. A new vintage watch sits in between, bringing some of the warmth of age with the reliability of more modern engineering. Integrated bracelet sports watches. Designs where the bracelet flows into the case seamlessly dominated the last decade, largely due to the influence of icons like the Royal Oak and similar 1970s sports silhouettes. For a while, these looks symbolize modern horological prestige and architectural boldness, but the market is cooling. The demand for integrated bracelets has softened, partially because collectors are remembering what else is possible. More traditional case shapes, simpler locks, leather straps paired with smaller proportions. There's a shift away from a visual complexity and toward intentional design. This doesn't happen in a vacuum. It reflects a taste evolution, from loud to refined to intellectual. Complications used to be defined by function. Chronographs for racing, GMTs for pilots, dive vessels for underwater timing. Now, we're seeing a revival of complications that are poetic as much as functional. The jump hour is a perfect example, a mechanism rooted in traditional watchmaking that displays time in a way that feels almost narrative, rather than purely utilitarian. Recently, conversations around jump hours and similar complications have gained momentum in the broader enthusiast world, including mentions by influential voices, like Nico Leonard, which have helped bring them to the mainstream view. The broader effect is that complications are no longer about measuring function, they're about celebrating mechanical craft and ingenuity. This is part of a larger trend. Watches behaving less like timekeepers and more like objects of crafted expression, where finishing, movement architecture, and design philosophy matter as much as legibility. There's a strong case that quiet elegance is returning. Oversized cases have their place, but they're tiring for many wearers, especially outside of sport or technical context. Integrated bracelet fervor is tempering. Meanwhile, quiet luxury and proportion are increasingly valued. Small dress watches, thin, unobtrusive, are attractive, precisely because they feel purposeful, without shouting. They interpret refinement and culture over sheer wrist presence. This trend aligns with broader lifestyle aesthetics, tailoring, subtlety, and wearability. A well-proportioned dress watch can be a daily wear, but also bring a sense of occasion. In that sense, the next trend may be less about being louder and more about being right-sized. Neo-vintage isn't just about age or style, it's about context. Watches began as a survival tool, they became navigation instruments, then luxury craft, then status symbol, then speculative assets. Now, they are cultural artifact. Neo-vintage sits between eras, history and present, craft and practicality, nostalgia and innovation. It's not just a label, it's a reflection of how our relationship with watches has evolved. And maybe that's why the term keeps coming back, because watches, like culture, are always negotiating their past and their future.